Welcome to Inside Tax Policy. I'm Sindhu Bloom.
And I'm Scott McCandless. This is your Monday briefing.
So, Scott, Congress is back this week.
That's right.
Anything going on?
Yeah, just a little bit. So first of all, they came back from a 2-week recess to begin what will be a 3-week work period before they take another recess. So we'll have them around for a little bit. And they've got quite a lot on their plate. I think some of the highlights include a House vote that seems likely to come up sometime on a balanced budget amendment. There'll be a variety of hearings on topics from budget to IRS administration to trade. IRS administration, in fact, actually has a bill potentially moving through the Ways and Means Committee, which seems fairly basic. It's bipartisan. Republican and Democrat joined together to introduce this. It seems to have the blessing of the committee. We'll see whether it undergoes any changes as it moves forward. But right now, it actually seems to be some fairly basic, long agreed upon bipartisan solutions for some general fixes to the IRS. Nothing too dramatic, not even rising to the level of a taxpayer bill of rights like we've seen in the past. Fairly basic administrative improvements seem to be on tap there.
But a really important issue.
And one thing that I think we'll see as a result of this is David Cowder from Treasury coming up. Who'll be, I think, at least 2 hearings this week, having the opportunity to testify, but also because he's going to be in front of a public camera in a public forum, we might have a chance to hear more of his thoughts about what else might be going on at Treasury. So we'll watch for that.
Excellent. And turning to even more serious matters, the CBO report. There's a CBO report coming out today. Fill us in on that,
Sure.
and also put into context kind of what it means in planning and how companies should kind of process information.
Yeah, great question. It's a great thing to be aware of. So the Congressional Budget Office today will put out a report that examines the budget and deficit situation. And this is important because it's one of the first looks that we've seen that incorporates both the post-tax reform world and the post-omnibus world. So just to remind our viewers, the omnibus is what came out right before the last recess, a little over 2 weeks ago, to keep the government open and keep funding going forward. But it also included some changes to spending priorities. In fact, ticked up some of the spending numbers that we've had in the recent past. But it also included an extension of budget caps, or so-called sequester, for a couple of years, which is supposed to balance that off at least over the next couple of years, through 2021 anyway. So the omnibus is pretty important, and the CBO report will look at both the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, and the omnibus to see their long-term impact. So what we expect to see from CBO will be really 2 projections. One is the projection that includes both of those things, the tax cut and the omnibus, and what does the 10-year budget window look like. But then they'll also give us a look at what it might look like if some assumptions change. So the first number will include the law as it is. The individual code expiring, the business provisions having some changes to them, such as the change from EBITDA to EBIT, the expiration of the expensing provisions, and things like that. That will help the budget picture over 10 years because with those expirations, we presumably would get more tax receipts, and that will level off what are otherwise not great numbers, but make them seem not as bad. But then they will give us a second set of numbers that will incorporate some of those presumptions. If we do the individual tax cuts and not let them sunset, what if we do keep EBITDA instead of EBIT? And they'll tell us which assumptions they're using, but once we start to see those numbers, it'll change and probably darken the outlook for the budget picture. And this becomes important to answer your question about the context, because there will be some votes coming up over the next few months, and maybe as early as this month, at least in the House, on making permanent some of those tax changes. Now, we expect that these votes will not ultimately result in enactment of new tax law, because we probably won't be able to get 60 votes in the Senate to send something to President Trump's desk.
Right.
However, this will color the debate. People will have the CBO report saying, look how bad these numbers will be if you make those provisions permanent, and yet we're going to hold votes on making some of those provisions permanent. So it's going to be a very interesting new dynamic in the political discussion.
Okay. And you mentioned that it's going to be dark. How dark are we expecting it to
I'm
be?
not entirely sure. We'll wait and see exactly what the CBO will see, but clearly the long-term deficit picture is not great. And what's also interesting about this, with the midterm election coming up in November, is the extent to which deficit issues may resurface as a public discourse. It really hasn't been that lively. It's percolated a little bit, but hasn't risen to the top of main issues with some of the other issues that have dominated public conversation and electoral politics, but this may resurface itself because of numbers like this.
Okay, and finally, a topic that is dominating probably your mind these days, trade.
Yeah.
So let me put my question to you this way. It's like we wake up every day and there's something else going on.
Right.
So how do you lay the land for us, lay the landscape for us, and talk about what is essential to know right now and what is serious and what isn't?
Sure. So let me start with China, because I think I can actually maybe hit not necessarily a pause button, but I think it's a great question to say this is serious, but maybe not the needle moving event just yet
Right.
that perhaps some of the early news reports have indicated it may be. This is very significant, very big deal. But remember the timeline here. We don't have any imminent action on China until at least May. And even then, it will probably be delayed beyond then. They have until May 22nd to get comments in to the United States Trade Representative on the proposed tariff actions against China. And in fact, USTR will hold its first hearing on May 15th, the public hearing. It's one and only. But that gives us almost a month of runway during which the Trump administration and Chinese officials are apparently meeting. They've already had some initial conversations. There may be other negotiations. And even after that May 22nd deadline for USTR to receive comments, that also will not signal the onset of sanctions. They may come yet another 30 days beyond that, if they come at all.
Okay.
So if we, again, we've talked about this before on previous shows, if we look to the steel and aluminum tariffs as illustrative examples here, then we may not see as big a tariff impact as the initial maximalist predictions or pronouncements seem like they may be. With steel and aluminum, many countries got exemptions. In fact, there really aren't that many left that are major enough steel producers to be impacted. So they ended up being a little bit watered down in the final analysis, which has had a diluting effect in terms of the economic impact, which I think is probably good. That may be the case here with China. Interestingly enough, it seems that there's broader agreement on China that there are some actions the Chinese could take to improve their overall trade standing, their actions on intellectual property and so forth have come under some fire, perhaps justifiably. So maybe they can move the needle in negotiations and never actually have to pull the trigger on the 50 billion plus. Remember, they proposed 50 billion. President Trump came out further and said, well, maybe we need an additional 100 billion. The Chinese have responded in kind at 50 billion, at least to start. But again, no tariffs are in place yet.
Right,
So
right.
I think that's a really important context to let this play itself out, maybe take a deep breath as we watch over the next month to see what happens.
That's a really good point you bring up, because I think everything that we hear every day just heightens the mood of, or I should say, heightens the tension around this issue. But in actuality, nothing has happened.
That's correct.
Okay.
Now, on NAFTA, just to turn to another very hot button trade issue, there actually are some more imminent actions going on with NAFTA, even though that seems to have fallen a little bit behind the scenes relative to China. So, as we know, they're trying to conclude some kind of agreement, and the clock is not their friend. They're trying to beat the Mexican elections. The presidential election in Mexico takes place on July 1st. So, they were trying to get something done before then. To that end, they finished the 7th round of talks with no agreement. Trying to figure out what to do next. They met on April 6th, Robert Lighthizer, the U.S. Trade Representative, as well as counterparts from Canada and Mexico to figure out what to do next. They said maybe we can get some kind of deal in place before a Summit of the Americas, which is due to take place, I believe, on April 13th.
Okay.
And if that can't happen, and it doesn't look like it will, that's just too short a runway here, then maybe they will have yet another round during the week of April 16th. It looks like that is the most likely outcome, that they will have to have that next round of talks. They've actually agreed on quite a lot, but what they've agreed on tends to be the easier chapters to put to bed.
Right.
There's still some serious concerns over rules of origin, especially around automobiles, around what to do around investor-state dispute issues, around government procurement. There are still some very serious issues still left on the table. Hopefully they can get those resolved next week. And if they can't, the big question comes up sooner rather than later. Will they accept a lesser deal, something that may not include the really controversial parts of NAFTA, and just try to get that done? Because again, they need to beat this clock that they're under to try to get ahead of some electoral politics, both in Mexico on July 1st and really in front of the United States in November.
Okay. And a note to our viewers that we will have an episode this week, an interview you did recently about NAFTA. So we're excited to be featuring that as well. Scott, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for joining us. This has been your Monday Briefing.